So, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Lisa Koppelman, and I work at the MRCT Center. I'm delighted to welcome you all today to part 2 of the webinar, part 1, which we conducted yesterday, called Facilitating Pediatric Medicines Development, Models of Global Cooperation. I'm delighted that you could all join today. I'd like to first start, and Kristen, you can start the slides whenever you like. This is the 4th webinar in a 5-part series called Advancing International Pediatric Clinical Research, funded in part by an FDA Scientific Conference Award. I'd like to first just run through a few housekeeping details. Next slide, please. As you all just heard, we are recording this. The recording will be posted to our MRCT Center website and YouTube channel. We'll get that posted in the next several days. I just want to reiterate from yesterday that I have no personal financial conflicts to disclose. And I also would like to remind all of us that the opinions that you will hear today expressed belong to those of the speakers and are not intended to be representative of the institutions, agencies, or governments that they are affiliated with. Thank you. Next slide, please. So today we're really going to jump right into things. For hopefully most on the call today were with us yesterday for part 1, but yesterday we had 4 fantastic presentations that went over existing models of pediatric regulatory approval. We heard from Dr. Donna Snyder from the FDA. We heard from Dr. Tahira Khan from AbbVie. We heard from Dr. Gilles Vassal from Accelerate, and we heard from Dr. Marie Valentin from the World Health Organization. After these presentations, which I will just reiterate were fantastic, we transitioned into a panel discussion moderated by Dominic Carris with all the panelists, with all the presenters you see listed and several additional panelists. And we discussed various strengths and opportunities of existing models of global cooperation. So with that as sort of a reminder, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Christina Bucci-Retwig from Novartis, who will be giving us a brief presentation today that will sort of pick up on the highlights of the presentations yesterday and set the stage for the panel discussion that will follow. So after Christina's presentation, we will move into a panel discussion that will be moderated by Dr. Robert or Skip Nelson from Johnson & Johnson. That's entitled Actions Towards Improving Existing Processes and Looking Towards the Future. And after that discussion, we will hand it over to Dr. Barbara Beer, the faculty director at the MRCT Center, who will provide a brief concluding remarks for all of us. So with that, again, my thanks to everyone, to all the panelists, to all the speakers and presenters, and to all of you in attendance today. And I will turn it over to Christina. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. I did forget that please note at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A, a question and answer button. When you have questions that you would like to pose to the panelists, please pop them into that Q&A function, and we will be able to convey those to the panelists and the speakers. So with that, thank you, and I turn it over to Christina.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Let me bring my presentation up for everyone. Okay. Just to confirm with the MRCT staff, it's on full screen now?
Looks perfect.
Very good. So thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those in attendance today. A very big thank you to the MRCT and the Planning Committee for this kind invitation to present for you today. My disclosures and disclaimers: I am a full-time employee of Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation, but as Lisa stated, what I'm going to present today should not be attributed to my employing company. Rather, these are perspectives from myself in reflection on yesterday's presentation and to address the needs for the panel discussion today. So I was tasked by the MRCT to consider the models of global cooperation that were presented on day 1 and to look across those models to provide my personal perspective on a blue sky view of how we could further evolve the pediatric medicines global cooperation space. So to do that, I will provide a very brief reflection on yesterday's presentations. Then what I will present and walk you through is my perspective on the interplay of convergence pathways and existing gaps where we have opportunities to evolve. And then I'll present at the very end an opportunity using what I see as a blue sky vision. So for my high-level messages from yesterday, what we heard in the presentations is clearly that the existing pediatric medicines development space has evolved, and existing policies in regions across the globe have enriched the innovative medicines development research space. What we also heard from our presenters was that for certain molecules and even in certain therapeutic spaces, authorization of pediatric uses of our medicines continues to lag well behind adult authorization of these same medicines. We also heard from the presenters that globally relevant and efficient pediatric medicines development does require global cooperation, as the development of our therapies are often intended for their global use. And what we heard is that in the existing cooperation structure using the cluster calls, EMA and FDA have found and published that they have a very high rate of convergence, where it was reported by the presentation yesterday to be approximately 70%. We also heard from one of our presenters that reliance models can be used truly for any regulatory function. And so the models that were discussed, just to remind all of you, and just as Lisa highlighted in her opening, each serve a very useful purpose. They should be considered to be complementary, and they should not be considered to be mutually exclusive. So those presentations on the cluster, parallel scientific advice, multi-stakeholder forums through the example of Accelerate, and reliance pathways all serve a very useful opportunity for us in evolving pediatric medicines development. Now, one thing I do want to highlight, the context of the discussion yesterday's were largely focused around one of the three archetypes of pediatric medicines development, and that is where pediatric development is being moved forward on the backbone of adult development, either for the same or similar indication. Of course, the phone always rings, right? Or different indications by molecular mechanism of action, or if we need to evolve our therapies to address an age-specific formulation. The context of the discussion yesterday did not really take into consideration where de novo pediatric medicines development is being pursued or where off-patent medicines are being repurposed. In that light is how I will now walk us through the rest of the considerations on how to think about evolving our global cooperation space. So when I think about what is in place currently, I see the following image in my mind. There are multi-stakeholder forums, which take many forms. And as a result of those discussions, which might take place across regulatory agencies, academic institutions and their experts, patient organizations, industry, and all others, that information is taken into regional health authority discussions, which in turn can be influenced by existing regional policies that are in place, which then shape the coordination and timing of how a sponsor will take a plan forward to the regulators to determine moving forward in pediatric medicines development. And then upon implementation, data that is being evolved in the space, either specific to that program or in the scientific space around where that drug is being developed, will further evolve what that plan looks like. And as a result of that, at the end of the day, data is generated that can inform regulatory decision-making and ultimately lead to a pediatric marketing application. So for purposes of the rest of my presentation, I will only be focusing on the interaction of the multi-stakeholder space and the regulatory interaction wheel that's in the center of your screen. Now, I want to first go to the multi-stakeholder forums, which were so expertly presented as an example by Gilles yesterday from Accelerate. And I think we all can agree that it is essential to incorporate or needs and patient and family perspectives into our development programs. These types of forums are valuable in establishing development expectations that are grounded in the best available scientific information for both the sponsor who will take the plan forward and the regulator or authority that will be evaluating that plan. Most of the existing stakeholder forums are pre-competitive by design. However, in the current environment, they're very limited, and they're limited to specific therapeutic spheres. And at present, there is a relative paucity of this work being done within the professional societies, such as rheumatology societies or infectious disease societies, to establish expectations for development. In addition, the forums that are currently in place are much better suited to investigational projects that are in the later stages of development, and less so for those projects that are really considering the point of discovery to bench. So when we think about the regional health authorities, what are some of the influences we need to think about when we are beginning to understand their role? First, when regional health authorities have guidance documents or are considering a proposal that's come forward, the regional health authority is going to take into consideration either established professional society considerations for the scientific content that's going to be in that plan, and or is going to pay attention to international bodies that might set research standards for development in those populations. If we take, for example, the FDA, the type of bodies we may be interacting with include the divisions. And this is true not only for our adult development, but specific for our pediatric development. So when a plan is submitted, it's being submitted to a division within CDER or within CBAR. When you look at the European Medicines Agency, there are multiple bodies that might be interacted with. We might be interacting with a scientific advice working party for specific scientific advice on our overall development program. We may be specifically interacting with the pediatric committee to discuss our pediatric investigation plan. And at the end of the day, when the proposal is being vetted for purposes of a regulatory decision a la that authorization, it is a CHMP who is the body that we're interacting with. And then there's all of the other national competent authorities, and clearly the screen's not large enough to list them. But companies may also be interacting directly with a national competent health authority if they are going to be working on a program which may have a greater prevalence or incidence in a specific region or country. So how about the regional policies, and how does that influence the potential for global cooperation? Well, all of you, I believe, are well familiar now with the existing pediatric regulations, and there are 4 key regions whereby there are obligations to develop pediatric medicine. So I have not presented the other regions that might have incentive programs in addition. These include the United States, primarily where work is being done through the Pediatric Research Equity Act or the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, the European Pediatric Regulation, the UK Pediatric Regulation, and the Swiss regulation through the Therapeutic Products Law. However, when we're developing our pediatric medicines, these are not the only policies that influence our development. There may, in fact, be orphan laws. In Europe, there's the PRIME process. In the United States, there's breakthrough therapies. And therefore, we may be using these additional policies as a method for us to interact with the regulatory agencies. So how about coordination and timing, and how does that play into this concept of global cooperation? And there are actually 2 separate sets of pathways that might be entertained. And one is through those regional advice pathways that exist with each of the regulatory agencies, or through dedicated pediatric procedural pathways. In the US, we might be interacting through advice pathways, for example, for our overarching program through the pre-IND process, or an IND meeting, or an end-of-phase transition meeting, or a Type B or a C meeting. In Europe, we might be interacting through the Scientific Advice Working Party to obtain advice. And when we're obtaining parallel, or we're looking to obtain parallel scientific advice, we're typically working across those bodies that would inform us for these specific types of meetings. If we're going to the national competent authorities, we might be seeking direct scientific advice. Or when there are alternative policy pathways, we might be seeking our advice, for example, through the breakthrough exchange or through the PRIME exchange. Okay, so now we get to the pediatric procedural pathways. And in the US, we might be going through the 210-day review for the pediatric study plan or submitting our requests through the PPSR to hopefully obtain a written request. In Europe, we're going through the PIP procedure. And in the UK, we're also going through a PIP procedure. However, when you look at the cluster calls are typically between just the US and the EU, Japan, Canada, and Australia. So there's an opportunity perhaps for the regulators to discuss interesting aspects of those development programs where they need to determine if they can seek alignment or if there's going to be divergence in their approach. And through those cluster calls, a common commentary may be distributed. However, there's also Switzerland, and Switzerland uses a reliance pathway. And in Switzerland, Swissmedic will adopt an agreed pediatric plan from either the US or the EU that was agreed through the appropriate pediatric procedure. And that plan is submitted through the marketing authorization application when submitted to Swissmedic for consideration. So you can see where this becomes very confusing very quickly for companies, and where sequencing of those discussions or the appropriateness of global cooperation could really be a very valuable tool. So how about the iterative process? And I think this one's more straightforward for us to consider. The iterative process is where the plan will be operationalized, data will be generated, the plan may need to go through an additional procedure to be modified or amended with the regulators. The data is then analyzed, and at the end of that process, the pediatric marketing application is submitted. And that's the last time you'll see me talk about the pediatric marketing application. So I told you at the beginning, MRCT challenged me to think of my personal blue sky vision and how we could evolve the pediatric medicines development cooperative space. This is our current environment. To me, the environment should look more like the following, where regulatory decision-making, the role of the patient voice in multi-stakeholder forums, and opportunities to utilize pathways such as reliance pathways should all be interconnected, interdigitated, and work seamlessly together to enhance the efficiencies of the procedure. And where this wheel of the interactions directly with the regulators to agree a pediatric plan should fit directly into that regulatory decision-making cog in order for this to work as efficiently as possible for our pediatric patients. So when we think about opportunities to evolve this interaction between the patient voice space, for example, using multi-stakeholder forums, and regulatory decision-making, I do see some opportunities for us. So first is an opportunity for when these wonderful publications that Jill talked about yesterday are published, if there are regulatory co-authors on that paper, how is that then incorporated and interlinked directly into regulatory guidance? Regulatory guidance is a process. It takes time and it takes layers of review to be endorsed and approved. However, that is the guide whereby sponsors are doing their development. So there's a huge opportunity for us to better incorporate outputs of these forums directly into evolving guidance documents. Additionally, there is a clear need for these types of forums to be expanded into other therapeutic areas. And again, Jill spoke about what's taking place with IMI C4C with 2 additional pilots. That needs to continue to evolve, in particular in areas where we are highly competitive and where there are numerous different mechanisms or drugs being developed to address pediatric disease. And I think the other opportunity we really have is if we intend to expand to earlier stage development, that true spot of discovery to bench, structural modifications of existing forums will need to evolve. And that's because company competitive information is going to be held close to chest unless proper consultancy or confidentiality is put in place, and whereby outputs of those discussions may be published to better clearly link into relevant regulatory agency websites and or be incorporated directly into guidance documents. I think the additional piece is that in adult medicines development, We see multiple publications or guidance recommendations, not only for different types of therapies that might be used in decision trees, but also recommendations of how to further evolve targets that have been identified for roles in different diseases. We don't see that as frequently in pediatrics. In some therapeutic arenas, yes, but we're not seeing this consistent approach of this intermarriage of the academic research space directly to help promote discovery. And I think this is a clear opportunity for us in pediatrics. How about this interchange between regulatory decision-making and opportunities to use reliance? I have some thinking here too that I think should help stimulate some discussion in our panel. Let me first focus on cluster and parallel scientific advice. And I want to re-emphasize, both of these pathways serve incredibly important roles. You don't see here that I'm calling for cluster to expand to sponsors, because I think there is a clear and necessary need for the regulatory agencies to have pathways to have internal discussions directly to their colleagues across borders. However, for this to be truly valuable, cluster calls should be expanding to incorporate all regions where obligations are in place. And that would better facilitate opportunities for reliance, and in particular in Switzerland, where their entire regulatory policy for their pediatric planning is dependent on reliance. In addition, I think a very simple piece to come from the cluster is that when the cluster calls lead to common commentaries, the agencies minimally need to review prior scientific advice that was given to those sponsors on those products to reduce any risks for contradictory regulatory guidance from those agencies. And that is in particular because the output of the cluster meetings is non-binding and therefore can lead to a great deal of confusion if it's contradictory to pediatric advice, to previous advice that was granted through the dedicated scientific advice pathways. When it comes to parallel scientific advice, this is a wonderful pathway that is not used enough. And it's not used enough because programs need to qualify for their acceptance. But what we heard from the presentations yesterday is that while the agencies converge quite frequently on their perspectives about specific questions raised through the cluster, there are 1/3 of those programs where there is not convergence. Those are the ideal programs that should be suggested directly to the sponsor that should go to parallel scientific advice. Sponsors are aware that parallel scientific advice does not mean same advice at the end of the day. But what it facilitates is an avenue for discussion, constructive discussion across the essential bodies to have a common understanding of where there is divergence and how to handle that in the development approach. So how about reliance? And reliance is something that I think we're not talking about enough as an opportunity, in particular for these pediatric programs that are being developed on the backbone of adult development, and where we're being told that there is already a very high rate of convergence between the regulatory agencies on components of a plan. If 70% of these programs have convergence, then it would seem to follow that we have an opportunity for 70% of these programs to be agreed much more efficiently through a reliance type pathway. And again, this is only for purposes of a plan. This is not for the purpose of a regulatory decision that's going to lead to an authorization. This is fundamentally just to agree the scientific plan to take the program forward. And I think we have two potential models that we can look to, and this is not exhaustive. This is just two potential models to facilitate our discussion and panel. And the first is exactly what the Swiss have put in place, which is full reliance on either a US or an EU decision on an agreed pediatric plan, which is simply accepted at the point of the marketing authorization application by the sponsor for their adult application. Those programs that don't have an agreement in place with the US or the EU are expected to develop their own Swiss pediatric investigation plan and agree that plan with Swissmedic. But this is a clear pathway and opportunity for us to facilitate cooperation, to facilitate efficiencies in pediatric medicines, to have a much broader global reach. The second model that I'd love to discuss is one that is not currently in place, but that we could consider. And that is where, from my vision, a sponsor would choose to either submit a PIP or a PSP for the usual regional procedure, build into that regional procedure an opportunity for a cluster to be held amongst the different regulatory agencies so that they can either have a discussion on key elements, or alternatively, is there a component of that procedure where other relevant agencies could listen into the discussion and discourse that the agency that is reviewing that submission is having? Use existing pediatric memorandums of understanding, or are there opportunities for us to put in place policies that would facilitate this to happen? And at the completion of that review procedure for either the PIP or the PSP, the other agencies would have the option to adopt the reviewing agency's opinion for the plan. So it wouldn't be a definitive. It would be established based on other reliance pathway opportunities where you're maximizing the resources of the agency, and you're also maximizing opportunities for efficiencies in the global development space. So I'm going to close here. And I think from my perspective, it is clear that regional policies have given us 2 decades of pediatric medicines development experience, but we should not stop here. We have a clear opportunity to evolve. And I think the children are expecting us to evolve to facilitate them. Global cooperation offers us numerous opportunities for enhancement. Clearly, it will enhance the scientific credibility of the plans and the overall value of the plan for their ultimate application by prescribers and for patients. Global cooperation will facilitate broader global impact for the many children of the world affected by disease, and clearly it will reduce inefficiencies while conserving regulatory resource. So I leave you with this parting comment from Henry Ford: coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, but working together is success. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was just a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate you walking us through the key elements of the various models of regulatory approval, and for sharing some of your thoughts, some of your visionary thoughts on opportunities for enhancing global cooperation. So with that, I'm delighted to turn things over to Skip Nelson, Dr. Robert Nelson, who will in turn be leading the panel discussion, moderating the panel discussion. So Skip, I turn it over to you. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. We have good representation across regulatory agencies, industry, as well as academic investigators. Let me at least start by first, since it'll be easier for me to see the panelists, maybe you could take down the slide currently and we can just see everyone. And if I could ask people to turn on their cameras and we can start a conversation. I would also suggest if you have something you want to say and I haven't called on you, please raise your hand. Let me start by maybe identifying 4 things that I heard Christina present, and in a sense of trying to move us towards a conversation about what might be actionable in the future and what we could potentially do. And these aren't in any particular order of importance, just as I heard them. The first is the ability to expand and to enhance the multi-stakeholder forums, and in particular, the connection between those forums and regulatory decision-making. I mean, there's that aspect that Christina emphasized. The second is she had some concrete suggestions for improving the cluster around making sure those regions that have a stake in pediatric development, particularly a regulatory stake in pediatric development, are included, and some suggestions for improvement of common commentary. Although honestly, I don't know how often there's a discrepancy between what happens and the scientific advice. The third, I think she begins to get into, I think, more blue sky. The third is, and she used the word, a global pediatric parallel scientific advice process. And by global, in other words, taking what's currently existing, focusing it on pediatrics, and perhaps enhancing it with other regulatory agencies as part of that process, consistent with the cluster recommendation. And then the fourth thing I heard was an appeal for the use of reliance methodologies in situations where there is, in fact, agreement, and citing the 70% convergence for the reliance and the 30% divergence for the need for parallel scientific advice. And then one final comment, and it's hard to know what goes into the cluster. In other words, this 70% convergence, 30% divergence, we have no idea what happens to those topics where either the EMA or the FDA says we don't think it's worth talking about. Is it not worth talking about because everybody agrees it's fairly straightforward, or is it not worth talking about because positions are fairly well fixed and there's no interest in changing that view or having that conversation? Hard to know which is the case. So all of that, I think, is a rich terrain for conversation. And I guess the way that I'd like to start here is, let me actually, in the interest of, I don't want to put people on a spot, but let me, Mark, you often have a lot to say, and I'd like to start with a different perspective than the regulatory perspective. I mean, we've got Health Canada, we've got EMA, we've got FDA on the call. I guess I'd like to sort of, as an observer of the chaos that often can occur in pediatric drug development, I'd be interested in your observations in whatever direction that you would like to take us.
Thank you very much. I'll aim for quality rather than quantity. My first observation would be that the clinical community, academics, prescribers, is very keen to expand on the multi-stakeholder forum idea. And in C4C, we've been very lucky that Gilles has been guiding us on that. And we want to expand. All of that takes time, resources, energy, and we need to find a way of getting that time, resource, energy into place, because I think Accelerate and Gilles' work and other groups have shown there's a need for this. Part of it is explaining to the clinical community the benefits to them of joining in, because they have to select their time, they have to move energy from one activity into another activity. Everyone's pressed, and together we need to have a good education program as to how people can be influential and what it means to be influential and the timescales of influence, so people can then do that kind of resource allocation as individuals. But yeah, we're well up for that, and we need to find a way to do it. The second point I'd make, I think referring to both today and yesterday, is the need to expand upon the scope of clinical input. The stakeholder forums looking at products, targets, whatever, fantastic, absolutely essential. But for me, the chaos often stems from not knowing enough about the populations that we're trying to study. And we get the feeling that somebody, be it the regulator or the sponsor or whoever, does a textbook exercise, wings a few friends, and comes up with a program that meets their interpretation of the available populations. And quite often, the external view of what's available is not the same as the reality. And we can expand upon what clinicians of all shapes and sizes can do if we bring people into conversations about the nature of the populations before it gets to the clusters, before it gets to PIPs. At the European Network for Pediatric Research at the EMA, we did develop what we called a preparedness guideline, looking at how to start off with what the textbooks say and ending up with a number of people who could be feasibly included in a drug development program. And the idea being to start off with that feasible number and design whatever it is around that feasible number, rather than what the textbooks say should be possible. And so I think whichever bit of blue sky thinking is possible, and I support everything that Christina said, but we need to bolt into that the voices of clinicians and children and young people about what's acceptable to them, what's feasible at the start of all of this. And so all of these global discussions need to allow for a more dynamic discourse with the clinicians, not just coming asking, here's our ideas, what do you think of them? The ideas that everybody has about drug development program need to start off with the reality that the clinicians are familiar with, but do that in a comprehensive, transparent way that is free from conflict and is done in a similar way across jurisdictions, so that the results can then feed into these discussions. So yeah, multi-stakeholder forums. If someone can give us the resource, then C4C and its successors can deliver them. That's very easy to do in Europe, at least. And also please take account of clinicians before you write the PIP, so that your PIP is more likely to be realistic. Thank you very much.
No, thanks, Mark. I'm interested. Peter, you raised your hand. I was actually going to call on you. Peter, you've been in academics and now in industry, obviously very heavily involved in the pediatric oncology space. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, but also I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about the challenges in getting in building the sort of culture, if you will, that makes something like the multi-stakeholder meetings possible. So Peter, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Skip. And by way of disclosure, I'm now in industry. I work for Sanofi, but I'm also on the steering committee of Accelerate and have been involved with Accelerate for a long, long time. So a lot to cover. Christina did a fabulous job. Christina, you ended with a quote from Henry Ford. Maybe I'll begin with a quote that's been attributed to Churchill, but I don't think he said it. It was, keep calm and carry on. And I think that's really something that we in pediatric drug development have to do, because when you look at the complexities, when you look at the silos, and when you think about the chaos, what I would say is don't panic. I mean, it can be overwhelming, but it can be addressed. So let me begin with maybe with Accelerate, and I'm speaking again for myself. But childhood cancer had an advantage in that the academic community had established networks that date back to the 1950s. And so the subspecialty grew up around collaboration. And the networks were both in the US and Europe. Accelerate came out of Europe, and it too evolved. But what was remarkable, and I don't think was expected, although we should have, Gilles invited representatives from EMA and FDA to the meeting. And fortunately, we had receptive people at both those agencies, and they came. The indirect consequence of that is when we told everyone representatives from FDA and EMA would be at the meeting, the tour bus full of industry showed up, right? All of a sudden we had, I think at its peak, 20 industry representatives at the meeting. And I think, as you know, Gilles is incredibly talented and can convince many people, but the fact that even in an unofficial capacity, FDA and EMA were there was the great catalyst to bringing virtually every pharmaceutical player in pediatric drug development to the table. And importantly, we had a number of parent advocacy groups that were at the table, and their voice was on par with really everyone else. In fact, on par might not be the right way to put it. Their voice was sought after, and they led these discussions. So it can be done. Resourcing it is not and has not been trivial. We were fortunate, and Gilles was fortunate that we had philanthropic funds to do it, because I think there was a concern that if we leveraged industry resources for the meeting, it would take on a different set of potential conflicts. And so Accelerate didn't want to do that. It really wanted to be a neutral platform that initially was driven from academia, but then very much became multi-stakeholder. And it's continuing to evolve. And I think, hats off to Gilles and all the people at Accelerate who've made it happen. And I do think it's a model that can be replicated, but it can't necessarily be replicated, certainly for every rare pediatric indication. There has to be a way to leverage certain structures to build it further. I did want to follow up, Mark, on one point you were making towards the end. And it's the importance of engaging children, adolescents, parents, and clinicians when you're thinking about pediatric development plans, in particular PIPs or PSPs, because we've all seen and PIPs put forward that, check all the boxes and we'll never get done, right? I mean, it's just not feasible, not addressing the important questions. And it really is a lack of communication. And this is not on the regulatory side. This is very much, I would say, on the industry side and industry and working with academic leaders to designing that. And what emerged early on in oncology were a number of PIPs that could never be done. And I think the point there is the regulations can only address a part of the challenge. It can't address everything. And so just having a PIP that's approved is not sufficient. You're really, if you, like any trial, you can have a great clinical trial design. If you have no patients on the trial, you've got absolutely nothing. So I think the importance of the community prioritizing what is most important for children and adolescents is essential to drive this, because I don't think you can bring all your resources to integrate with these systems for everything in a company's portfolio or everything that clinicians may be interested in. There has to be a prioritization, and that's probably the hardest thing to do. But if you do prioritize, what I have learned is that all these different silos and all the different agencies and subgroups that you have to interact with ultimately want to do the right thing. No one is against developing drugs for children, or virtually no one is against developing drugs for children. They all want to do the right thing. They're working in systems that were never designed to do that. And so you do need advocates, you do need people to drive it. And if you try to do everything at once, it's unlikely you're going to succeed. But if you can prioritize, you can make progress.
So Peter, let me follow up with you on that issue of prioritization, but just to give people a heads up, what I'd like to do after your answer is transition to some of the more regulatory suggestions that Christina had around parallel scientific advice and reliance. Prioritization, and my understanding, I mean, I had the the privilege of sitting through one of the multi-stakeholder meetings because I really wanted to see what happens. And it was interesting just to see the robust scientific and clinical conversation among the various stakeholders within one of the Accelerate meetings. But prioritization never came up there. And my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's often then a private later meeting based on that multi-stakeholder engagement process where the companies get together and then explicitly talk about prioritization prior to then engaging with whether it's the EMA or the FDA around the pediatric plans. And I might say there was one comment, when we say PIP, that's short for the European Pediatric Plan. When we say PSP, that's short for a US Pediatric Plan. So So Peter, I'm just curious, the actual prioritization that you talk about, I know that's a very important aspect of what Accelerate is trying to achieve, but my understanding is it takes place then behind closed doors, and I'm just, and then flows into the plans that are then proposed. Could you say anything more about what actually happens there from an industry perspective? And then maybe I'll turn to Ralph and say, well, how that impacts then on what the EMA is seeing in terms of the oncology pediatric plans.
Yeah, so I'd love to say we get behind closed doors and solve everything. That's simply not the case. I think the meetings are viewed as a first step, and I don't think any of us truly expect that if we just stopped at the end of the meeting, something magical would happen after that. So there are meetings that follow up. I think regulators are in a difficult position because I don't think they can show preference to one company over another company. However, the academic community that conducts and the networks that conduct research do have a voice. If we have a first-in-class drug, well, that generally is going to be a priority if it's highly relevant to pediatrics. And even if it's second in class, it's likely to be high priority because we all know that not everything succeeds. But as you get down to third, fourth, fifth, or sixth in class, it really begs the question, should we develop it at all? And I think that's where, where the discussions are as far as there's some diseases where it is global development. It's both US and Europe and other countries and the networks who have to work together because of the rarity of the disease. There are times when the European consortia or the US consortia may decide to study different areas, but those discussions take place. So there's not either direct competition or an overlap, but it is an evolving process. We haven't solved prioritization. I mean, first, you get a group of us academicians in a room. It's rare that you'll have everyone agree on anything, but I think consensus can emerge. And then ultimately, there's a window of opportunity to do this, because if it takes us too long, everyone's interest moves on. So that's where the prioritization comes in, but we haven't solved it, Skip. I think we still have a lot of work to do at multiple levels to prioritize, because without the prioritization, I think everyone is going to be floundering a bit to figure out where do we go.
Christina, do you want to expand on that point before going to Ralph?
I want to make one clarification for the record, is that antitrust laws would prevent us from having meetings behind closed doors. That is not allowable unless we actually have existing contracts for co-joint development. So I just want to make sure that that's officially on the record. And I think on this comment about prioritization, Peter, the only thing I was going to add here is I think one of the benefits that has clearly come from these strategy forums is that where prioritization has come in is in what tumor types should no longer be pursued with these types of molecular targets. And I think that is a very clear benefit, that we are not wasting the precious resource of patients in trials that should not be conducted. And I think that when I think about the prioritization win that has come from those forums, that's the win. I think entirely to what Peter said about what the regulators can and cannot do by choosing a winner. Industry as well is not choosing a winner. It's really what's coming from those programs and how competitive the space is that would allow a fifth, a sixth, a seventh study to be conducted in that same limited ultra rare space.
Right. Thank you. And thank you for that clarification about antitrust. That's very important. Ralph, do you want to respond, given your experience at the receiving end of this activity?
Okay, thanks, Skip, and really a brilliant discussion. I just wanted to clarify, actually, we are not only at the receiving end. I also believe specifically for Accelerate, regulators and also EMA were one of the driving forces to develop such a meeting and such a structure. And, if we just say, okay, let's have a multi-stakeholder meeting, it means in this case, it meant really developing trust. And that took years until, I mean, just very pragmatically, that took years. For the closed door, so we are involved as Jill said, FDA colleagues during the discussions, and what was mentioned as behind closed doors perhaps more refers to the fact that just regulators leave the room. I mean, there's still people there, so I don't think that regulators are the ones who open and close doors necessarily. It does then facilitate for us to keep our role and our task, as has been described, that we all are pushing for the same, but every one of us has a different task in this system. And indeed, we have insisted on the fact that no regulatory decisions are taken during such a forum. That is, again, has very pragmatical reasons, and then also referring to Christina's SKY, you know, the downside is if you interconnect more and more multiple stakeholder meetings into direct regulatory decision making, there is a risk that it becomes not so flexible anymore. That if we are a co-author somewhere, it is automatically a guidance. I don't know how long these papers would take to come to life. So we are seeing it as a space, as an opportunity for interaction, where we indeed can sit around the same table for certain topics. So how it is then practically done is that, as Jill has described, the outcome is published as a scientific paper, and this can be taken into account for regulatory decision-making by PDCO. So applicants can refer to it, and they do refer to it in their PIPs, and PDCO really takes it on board. It doesn't mean that it agrees to each and every point. It depends on the context. But that is really accepted as a really important input. Just also for the stakeholder meetings to further expand, I just would like to warn or like to be cautious about the practical aspects, because as Peter also has mentioned, academics not agreeing. I mean, we all have our interests, and what we have to be careful that we now develop complicated structures, you know, for conflict of interest, for all these aspects, which also clinicians might not be free from, or even patients might have a bias, and so perhaps yes, don't panic and carry on developing this model. Thank you.
No, thanks, Ralph. So Diana, I see your hand is up. The floor is yours.
And I know Christina's hand, I think, may have went up before mine.
But
okay,
but
it sounds like she's
deferring
good.
to you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you, Christina, for an excellent presentation. And that was very thought-provoking. And I'm enjoying the discussion so far. So Deanna Green from FDA. I want to piggyback on a couple of things that Ralph said. And I also want to talk about the importance of professional societies that Christina raised. In terms of these multi-stakeholder forums, I think we all agree here, and I think as demonstrated by the presentation yesterday, their value is, you know, astronomical. These are important sessions for us to be able to really have robust discussions in a public forum with all voices present, or as many voices as possible, and stakeholders there, so that we can talk through some very complicated matters as we've discussed. It is important that the model that Accelerate has set up can be used and considered to be expanded beyond pediatric cancers, you know, of course, recognizing the resources that would cost. But to Ralph's point about the capturing of the proceedings, it's really important to keep that largely decoupled from guidance, as he mentioned, because the value of those proceedings is that you're getting a picture of the discussion as occurred. It doesn't mean that all parties agreed with everything that was said, but you're hearing what all stakeholders put forward in the conversation, and we're able to all take that information and chew upon it and bring it back to our prospective organizations for further discussion. Guidance comes, you know, many steps away. As Ralph pointed out, to have scientific publications come out such as these that are simply proceedings, accurate reflections of what occurred, is much more quicker process than having a guidance come out that describes all of the points that were agreed upon and policies being set forward. So I just want to make the distinction between those two. It doesn't mean, again, that that information that was discussed at the stakeholder meeting doesn't then get discussed internally as we are thinking about future guidance and policies in these spaces. But in terms of professional societies, I think Christina raises a very important point. What I have observed is that we have a lot of professional societies who are actively involved in these types of processes, that are really thinking about drug development, that want their voices heard, that are tuned into all of this. But we have a lot that aren't. And how can we think about bringing in more and thinking about how we can have more consistency of professional societies being actively engaged in product development considerations. As we've all said, they're clinicians or folks that are represented within those professional societies are on the ground and are holding on to valuable knowledge that will serve all of us in terms of understanding best approaches for some of these conditions and diseases, particularly complicated ones. And so just thinking about how do we more uniformly get professional societies engaged in this type of work, so that not that there's anything wrong with seeing the same players at every multi-stakeholder meeting, but I do think there are many societies that are untapped and are sort of not even aware of their value in these types of forums.
No, thank you, Deanna. And before going to Christina, I think Ralph's comment about trust, I think is essential, and building that within those communities. Let me go to Christina and then to Mark, and then I would like to transition to talk a little bit about the reliance model and the parallel scientific advice proposals that Christina had. But go ahead, Christina, and then Mark.
Yeah, I'll do my best to be brief on this. So thanks, Deanna. Exactly what I was thinking about professional societies. There truly is a wealth of experience that is untapped as yet for pediatric medicines development. And I think that this is the next forum for us to go to. And then I did want to touch on that word guidance, because I didn't actually say written guidance. I was purposeful in including that. I think there's all forms of guidance that come from regulators. And I think, Ralph, entirely to your point, I agree completely that getting to a written guidance is typically lengthy, and then science may evolve. But there are other avenues that can be taken. Number one, in those publications or proceedings, are there opportunities for, when a regulator is a co-author, that they seek the internal authorization to say they are supported? Their institute, this should be considered to be the perspective of the employing institution. That's an opportunity, number one. Number two, there's opportunities such as lists. There's NIH, BPCA, therapeutic lists. There's molecular target lists. When is this information coming from proceedings and being taken and transmitted into those types of lists? So I think there's other types of ways for us to think about guidance and how that could be applied to help further spread the word about the importance of those proceedings, but also be more efficient in their applicability to plans that are being developed or modified. And then the other piece I wanted to raise, and Mark is right in front of me, so I feel as if I would be a failure not to mention that these forums not only develop disease-specific valuable proceedings for us to use in pediatric medicines development, but critical paths, International Neonatal Consortia developed an incredible clinical pharmacology guidance that had the incorporation of perspectives from key regulatory agencies across the globe. And that guidance, when it came from the consortium, ultimately was taken up by those regulatory agencies and adopted, and has been so meaningful to how we think about neonatal populations when we are going to be developing therapies for the neonatal population. So I think it's more than just the disease piece as well. It could also be on aspects related to pediatric medicines that has an opportunity to much more efficiently evolve the pediatric medicines development space. Thank you.
Thanks. Mark, over to you.
Thank you. Just some practical comments to Dionna's question about how to involve medical societies or the clinical community more generally. We have some good practice, as we've heard from the International Neonatal Consortium or our own C4C project. There's also the Healthcare Professionals Working Group at the European Medicines Agency, which is a direct group made up of 30 learned societies across Europe. There are 30 of them. There's only one voice for pediatrics, which happens to be me. And it's interesting to contrast the enthusiasm with which the cardiologists come to that meeting, the family practitioners and everybody else, except for the medical societies that I try and represent for pediatrics, because pediatricians are often overwhelmed, because they don't understand what's happening. Just as you said, Jon, we need to spread the word, and we need to do it in a way that is somehow quality assured, so that we can then be comparable in what we're asking people and what we're finding out across the jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. It's I think the purpose of today's meeting is to how to have that conversation in a way that's consistent across all these areas. And maybe there's a spin-off group to try and find out ways to do it. But it is about telling people why their input's useful and then giving them the means to make a judgment about how they spend their time. Either they see a sick child or they join the conversation about right. Stakeholders, and that's the balance people have to make. So you do have to give them some ammunition for that.
Right. Thank you, Mark. Samadhi, I see your hand is up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Skip. Just a couple of minor comments and follow up to what Christina just said. When I was a regulator a few years ago, I think public-private partnerships and these discussions played a very important role. And the work that was done in those groups, primarily in the adult infectious disease area, actually translated into more than one guidance. So I think the very robust discussions are very helpful in formulating guidance documents. I don't think we should minimize the impact of that on guidance development. The other point was just as a follow-up to what Mark said about academic participation. I think, again, my viewpoint may be biased coming from an infectious disease background. I think it's really not seen as something very attractive for a lot of academic participants to necessarily be involved in trials involving drugs and pharmaceuticals. I think it doesn't seem to carry the same weight in terms of what it gives them in terms of their academic promotions and recognition. So I think that piece is really missing, and how best can we build upon this relationship and make it valuable to both parties, I think is something we should look at. And really, and this is a discussion we are having in the pediatric infectious disease space, is how also to increase interest from young investigators, because right now, there is a cohort of people that are going to be fading out soon, and I think leaving behind a great vacuum. So what we could do in the academic space to build interest among the young investigators to participate in drug development, not just for adults, but for children as well, right, I think would be important. So just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, just as a quick comment on that, I think the oncology community has different ways to try and solve that. I mean, the challenge of when you have multi-institutional trials that are in large cooperative groups, how do you give young investigators credit and allow them to grow and evolve within that space, I think is, in fact, a broad challenge. It's a little bit outside of our remit today, but let's just sort of note that. I would like to move our discussion a little bit to the global regulatory cooperation. And there were two concrete recommendations that Christina had. One was what she termed a global pediatric parallel scientific advice, which would, in my mind, by putting the word global, be more expansive than what's currently existing between the FDA and the EMA. The other is her second model. The first model was just accept someone else's pediatric plan. The second model, once it's completed, the second model was something where, other agencies would rely on the procedures of one agency and at least be involved in some way in the understanding of how that agency is evaluating that procedure and ultimately getting to a final plan. Now, of course, all of this, I don't think we would say that it would always remain voluntary. I mean, one could accept that. So I'm curious to begin, and I'm going to and I'm looking at our regulator colleagues, but I specifically would like to bring in Alicia, if I may put you on the spot, because Health Canada is a participant in the cluster. I know you have relationships with other agencies of like mind and like size, and EMA and FDA are not like size. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how those particular ideas that Christina put on the table look from your perspective from Health Canada. Again, your individual perspective, not representing obviously Health Canada.
Yes, excellent. I have a lot of thoughts from my own personal perspective on the matter. And thank you so much, Christina. That was a really excellent presentation. Some really good, thought-provoking ideas in there. So Canada has been considering implementing a pediatric regulation, and so we've been talking with the FDA and the EMA and Swissmedic and the UK to sort of understand the benefits and the costs and what every jurisdiction has sort of learned in terms of how we might think about developing our own as a medium-sized regulator with a much smaller population than both the US and Europe. And then we've also had conversations with our industry colleagues as well within Canada and some globally as well. And I think the common thread across a lot of those discussions is that there is a lot of value in the reliance model. So in Swissmedic's model, and relying on or just requiring a PIP or a PSP to be submitted as part of the market authorization, because that allows them to use their internal resources efficiently, and it is more acceptable to sponsors, because then it's not another negotiation that needs to happen with a small regulator. And so I think there is a lot of value to considering that model. One of the things that I personally have been thinking about, I can't speak again on behalf of Health Canada or the Access Consortium, for example, but I have been thinking recently about what potentially we could do on the pediatric plan front with the Access Consortium. So for those who don't know, Access is a consortium of 5 small, medium-sized regulators who work together on work sharing of drug submissions. And I do take point of the conversation on trust that was brought up a little bit earlier. That work sharing initiative took many years to develop the trust that it requires to do a work sharing model. And I guess I've been wondering recently whether, especially because the UK is part of it and Swissmedic is part of it, and as Canada, we're also considering implementing a pediatric regulation, where would Access be a spot where we could potentially work share with pediatric plans that get submitted. So obviously it's just a thought, but would bring 5 regulators theoretically together to facilitate that process. In terms of Christina's specific ideas, for the cluster, so we are participants in the cluster, and we are very happy and grateful to participate. I think we learn a lot. It is difficult sometimes to actively participate in the cluster, just because we don't get the submissions until later on, and so we don't have the background knowledge or data or the plans that were submitted, and so that makes it more difficult to participate meaningfully. That said, I mean, there's always room to change how things are done. to make that that participation potentially a bit more meaningful. So maybe I'll pause because I feel like I just said a lot, but happy to add on to what others have to say.
That's great. Thank you, Alicia. Just for the benefit of those that don't know, the Access Consortium, you mentioned 5 agencies: MHRA, Swissmedic, Health Canada. Who are the other 2?
Singapore and Australia. Sorry.
So Singapore and Australia. So you've already got 2 groups that are on the cluster, plus minus active. One that uses Reliance explicitly, model 1 of Kathleen, another that has a PIP requirement, but not using Reliance, and then Singapore. So it would be interesting, perhaps, to see what work sharing would look like in that setting. I think that's a very promising suggestion.
And again, just my own personal.
I know, but it's yeah. I mean, it's an interesting group of different approaches, and maybe that should be part of the conversation among those 5 groups. It's something to keep in mind. Let me then turn to Deanna and Ralph. What would Reliance look like from an FDA and EMA perspective? I mean, is that and I will point out, I guess, in the Q&A, there was one question that basically asked, is it even legally possible? Given the different regulatory frameworks that exist within Europe and the US, we might think it's a good idea to try and move towards a Reliance model, but what would it take? Is it feasible? And would it require enabling legislation, which would obviously up the threshold to be able to do something like that? So I'm just curious. I don't know, Deanna or Ralph, which one of you would like to sort of provide your thoughts first, or you're waiting for the other to go? Ralph, you came off.
Okay.
You came off mute first, so go ahead.
Normally I would say ladies first, but no problem. Yes, indeed. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and I would personally always take the approach, okay, we would have to make it happen. I do believe it would, if we would have to change legislation, because whereas Christina said in this respect or in this context, a PIP or PSP, it's only a plan. She later said such collaboration would make the plan even better. So on one hand, it's only a plan, so we can have Reliance, and then for the actual marketing authorization or actual regulatory decision, it goes back to regional centers. So I do find it interesting, because in our case, it is not, I mean, we have a plan, and this plan, as Christine has also explained, then leads actually, or is the basis for regulatory decision making. And at the moment, okay, our legislation does say, a PIP has to be prepared. Perhaps one could find different ways of doing this, but again, we have to be careful that we don't create even more hurdles and more complexity. Also, like developing new global structures. Why should we, as we internally always discuss, why shouldn't we make use of our existing structures first? So try to use our existing structures and still be inclusive in discussions, in inviting other agencies to discussions with companies or such approaches. So I'm a bit hesitant with the Big Bang approach, whether it is realistic, but I believe we are inching in a way, however you call it, whether you call it Reliance or you call it enhanced collaboration. I think we are moving in that direction, but there might be hurdles.
Thank you. Christina, your hand is up, but Deanna, do you want to comment before we hear from Christina?
Sure. Yeah, I hesitate to use the word reliance as well, because it has, clear significance, and there's a clear historical notion to that. But I certainly can envision enhanced collaboration amongst regions, and what that looks like will be something that we can further discuss. I do think there is challenges with sort of just kind of one size fits all, or one approach. There are clear differences even between FDA and EMA that I think everyone's aware of. It's not so simple in terms of being able to say that we can easily adapt some of these things that have regulatory consequence or legislation behind them. And so I do think it's a more fruitful discussion to think about in the context of where things are, in the context of legislation that is currently established. What are things that we can do to, further extend what's happening, as opposed to a consideration of changing the laws, as you may have mentioned, Skip. And I know you were just throwing that out there, like what would it require? But I mean, those are very large hurdles, I would say. And so I think, the group really should think about kind of what within our current frameworks can be expanded as opposed to demolished and start over again.
Right. I think the message that Christina gave, I would agree with, is that we don't think anything needs to be demolished. Everything has its place, but whether we need something new is an open question. So Christina has her hand up, but I want to just give a note that I'd like to try and get Begonia involved. She's unfortunately on a train, and I'm not sure if her connection is great, but let me hear from Christina, and then Begonia, I'll go to you to hear your thoughts, having listened to this conversation. So Christina, you first. Go ahead.
Yeah, so as a policy person, I feel the need to say all things are possible, and legislation is not necessarily needed to implement good practice. So there are ways that global cooperation could be implemented without any change to legislation. Legislation makes things easier because it's in the law and it has to be done. But we saw yesterday in the presentation, and we've seen this previously, where when you put the pediatric investigation plan template side by side with the pediatric study plan template, or with the written request template, or with the UK PIP template, the content is essentially identical between what the two regions are asking for. Granted, and Deanna, I'm going to take your point entirely, the legal requirement to development is different between the two regions. I would argue that it would make sense before any policy is put forward that changes a law, that there clearly has to be evaluation of existing outputs from existing laws to understand how well that would make sense. But I think we should be taking the attitude of anything is possible, in particular because we're hearing, and we've been hearing this for years now, that there is relatively good convergence between the agencies that are requiring the law. So why wouldn't we want to make these processes more efficient? We also have opportunities. We have opportunities because the pediatric regulation is open, right? We have an opportunity now with Europe. In the US, we go through a 5-year review. In my policy experience, and Peter, I think I'm going to take a comment from you from earlier, which is every time I've gone to the Hill, when I've gone to Brussels, I have not found a single legislator that hates children. They love children. In fact, they show me the pictures of their children. They show me the pictures of their grandchildren. And if as a community we went forward and said, this benefits children, if we went as multiple stakeholders to say this benefits children, I promise you, legislation will pass, regardless of how broken certain governments' legislative processes are at present. So I think it's an avenue of, are we willing to assess opportunity? Are we willing to find opportunity? And if we couldn't go through the legislative processes, could we find pathways for implementation to facilitate? Would already be a step in the right direction. So I'll stop there.
Well, with that, let me see if Begonia has a connection that's good enough for her to to comment after that inspirational call to arms on the part of Christina. Begonia, are you able to join us?
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry for being late. I have followed the discussion, and you know that my area of expertise is the involvement of children and young people. And there is, plenty of opportunities. I see that it's important also to collaborate between the EMA and the FDA, Canada, and other regulatory environments, because the projects usually run in parallel. And at least from the perspective of Europe, the new fully implemented clinical trial regulation, it's promoting the involvement of the patients in the clinical trial protocol, which is good. It's not mandatory, but encouraged the different study teams from academic or commercial studies to involve the patients and the young people. And for us, it's the only way to help to perform really patient-centric clinical studies. We don't know another way than work with young people or parents when it's not feasible directly involve the young patients in these early stages. In some cases, we have done projects and initiatives to really know exactly which are the unmet medical needs of these diseases, because it's really important to envision what is going on in a patient and in a family living 24 hours, 7 days per week, basically with rare conditions. This is the scenario in which we work with pediatrics, and the clinical trial protocol design for us, it's a really meaningful moment to get the input of the patients. Our area of expertise, obviously, it's not regulated, but since in this appendix number 1 of the European regulation, we have this specific statement to ask to the study teams about the feedback of the patients helping in the process to design the clinical trial protocol. Something is there that it's helping us to move forward to the direction that hopefully will be common in the future, that it's involves the patients and the parents in all the studies, not only in few ones, because still it's very anecdotic, the role of the patients in our research. And also from the perspective of the network that we are leading in Europe, EYPACnet, the European Young Persons Advisory Group Network, we are really interested to collaborate with other regulatory environments and not only benefit the patients and the families in the European ecosystem, hopefully also in other regulatory environments. And for this is key, that all the stakeholders will work together, we educate, we train, and we work for the awareness and the needs that the pediatric patients they have. This is a summary of my point of view in this discussion that you have today.
Thank you. Thank you for offering that. Peter, your hand is up.
Yeah, a few different comments. Let me first begin and follow on Begonia's. And again, I apologize for my voice, but hopefully it'll last. What I had the privilege of having a brief view of the work that Begonia has done in Barcelona, and the concept that children, adolescents shouldn't have a voice here, I think, has been put to rest. What Begonia and her colleagues in Barcelona have done in a very impactful way and productive way has brought children to the table of clinical trials. And so it can be done. It takes work, it takes infrastructure, it takes effort, but I can say probably nothing as impactful as hearing from the patients themselves on what clinical research means. So there's a model that we can follow that was developed. I think the other brief comment, and it follows on what you said, Skip, about no one wants to demolish anything. I hesitate to use the word demolish, but when I look at how clinical protocols have evolved, and primarily in cancer, childhood cancer, but in other areas, what I usually say is they've evolved without Darwinian forces. So nothing seems to be shed from clinical research. We just continually add on. So there's no natural selection. And I suspect that's true in other areas as well. But when I look at where Christina began, and I don't pretend to know all the different components, but I wouldn't take off the table that there's a potential to streamline, that there's a potential to say, do we need to do it this way, or are there more efficient ways? I wouldn't take that off the table because, like everything else, from academia to industry to regulators, the evolution, it's much harder to get rid of something than it is to necessarily add something. And the last point I was going to make was responding to the idea of the global infrastructure and potentially doing it globally. I think that would be a value, but now, comes the however. A colleague of mine, Steve Du Bois in Boston, published a paper looking at the time from first in adult clinical trial to first in children clinical trial for cancer in the era that followed at least the initial wave of regulations and incentives from EMA through the PIPs and from the FDA through PREA. The median time between first in children and between first in adult and first in children was 6 years. So despite the progress we've made, children still are not benefiting from the scientific advances that in a timely manner. So in agreement, I think both with Ralph and Deanna, we want to be careful as far as adding to the complexity. But I would also say, and I would welcome their response, and this is more to my colleagues in industry, is that there's nothing really preventing you from starting early for important therapeutics. I personally don't think you need to have a finalized PIP or a finalized PSP to get started. And the sooner you get started, the sooner you seek advice. But the idea that you have to wait till everything is done before you can even say go, and I understand there's a risk and a reluctance, and I'm not proposing you do it or one does it for every drug, but if there's a potential real therapeutic advance that you believe can greatly benefit the pediatric population, I don't think there are barriers to get started. You need to engage with regulators, but you don't need to finish everything before one gets started. But I would welcome responses to that.
Well, so Peter, you stimulated 3 hands to go up, and I'm going to specify the order, but then I want to highlight a topic I'd like to touch on. So it'll go Deanna, Christina, and Ralph. But I also want to at least acknowledge a little bit of time, and I'm going to eventually put Samadhi perhaps on the spot here, is thinking about Marie's presentation yesterday about the reliance developed by WHO, and in many sense that's developed in the context of countries that don't have the same kinds of resources. And in the course of the MRCT project, we've been very conscious of the challenges of this conversation, EMA, FDA, healthcare. I mean, in other words, it's occurring within a highly developed regulatory environment. It's also true that many of the programs that are designed on the backbone of adult programs are not addressing major diseases that are occurring within the developing world. So I want to at least carve out a little bit of time after we hear from our 3 hands that are up to at least talk about that issue a little bit and see if there's some ways we can begin to maybe get some traction, if you will, on addressing that. And so I'm going to, Samadhi, put you on the spot after we hear from Deanna, then Christina and Ralph. So Deanna, to you.
Yes, thank you. So I just want to say that as part of, this panel, we came to discuss some of the excellent presentations we heard yesterday about the 4 models of global cooperation that were presented, and of course build upon what Christina summarized so nicely today to stimulate us to think forward and think beyond. And I think that we've established that there's clear value in some of these models that are already ongoing. And could they be refined? Absolutely, right? That's part of, I think, just our general practice in pediatric product development. All of us who've been involved as stakeholders, we gain experience, we look back and we say, okay, and we tweak as we go. And I think that's actually been a really successful component of the evolution of pediatric product development over time. But one of the other things that we, were charged to think about as a panel was, is there a different model? So, okay, yes, refine the ones we have, but is there something else? Particularly now that we're all at a different stage and we're thinking beyond just maybe, for example, the regions that are represented currently on the cluster. And we're thinking to the points of some of what Marie discussed yesterday. Are there other models beyond these four? Are there other things that we can think about that may have a role now in where we are in pediatric product development and global development in general? So I just wanted to mention that. And then in terms of what Peter just mentioned about starting early, of course, from a regulatory perspective, that's our dream, right? To have those conversations very early, but beyond conversations, to actually have actions early. But, we also recognize that there are business models at play. There are risk considerations in terms of how industry decides when and where and what will occur at what time. But that is a message that I think we've all been strongly encouraging, is that are there things that can start beyond a certain point now that we have a host of experience, so that we can start to edge away at that gap that we still have, that large gap that we have regarding adult marketing approval to the time when we do have some information for pediatrics and labeling. I'm not saying that's a simple, easy answer. I'm just, posing and adding on to what Peter said. That is something that we should be thinking about. And I encourage industry to think about, are there items that can begin that would chip away at that has a risk, of course, that has a cost, but perhaps the cost is not as great and impactful that it can't happen, particularly if there's been established now some predictability around some aspects of pediatric product development. I know we've had conversations about, can some aspects of formulation work begin earlier? Again, I'm not in industry. The business decisions behind that, are beyond me. But those are sort of some of the things that I think will help, because the sooner we have that information in pediatric information and labeling, at least in the US and Europe, that then helps all these other regions we're talking about, right? But we still have such a large gap. So we'd love to hear Christina's thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I loved your question. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to up the ante even further. And you know me well enough to know that I kind of like to do that. So I would even go so far as to say, I think we need to be very careful in the pediatric community to think that a PIP or a PSP is even necessary to start pediatric development. I think we're getting ourselves into trouble with this. The reality is 1/3 of all new molecular entities and new active substances between the US and the EU are now being approved with pediatric indications for use. And a larger and larger portion annually are for dedicated pediatric products. And I am going to advise that for that archetype of drug, where it's novel for a pediatric indication, we are routinely not agreeing our PIP and PSP before we start, because we've sought the appropriate scientific advice through the appropriate regulatory agencies. And frankly, for many of our pediatric programs that are now for the second archetype, that pediatric development on the backbone of adult development, more and more and more, our program teams are going to scientific advice because that pediatric component is an integral part of the development. And we are having these conversations early, but I don't want to confuse people by thinking that you have to have the PSP agreed or the written request agreed or the PIP agreed. And I think that we're getting ourselves into some trouble by thinking that that is necessary. And in some instances, it actually muddies the development situation. And that's why I showed that slide up front about the different regulatory pathways. because there are very legitimate regulatory pathways for that conversation to take place between the sponsor and the competent agency at stake. And so I think as we move forward, one of the evolutions we need to take so that we can get to a better global cooperation and evolving this space is to not let requirements to agree a pediatric plan slow, trip up, or potentially get in the way of more efficient, good quality pediatric medicines development.
Lisa, Ralph's hand is down. Your hand went up, so I give you the response. See if Ralph wants to add, but I think I'll go to Samadhi then, perhaps. So quick. I want to leave a little time for Samadhi to talk about the challenges in development and outside of the developed countries. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, excellent. I do see that Ralph's hand did go back up, but so it was actually something that that Diana said that sparked a bit of a thought. And while it is definitely true that the pediatric data that gets submitted to the US and to Europe is helpful globally, that data doesn't often get submitted to other smaller regulators. So it's helpful to our clinicians who can then, make decisions about off-label use in the smaller jurisdictions, but that data doesn't often get to the smaller regulators. And so I think that's why you see Swissmedic, for example, implementing their model, and that's one of the reasons why we're considering that as well, because we want to increase access to these products to children in Canada. And so I guess one of the things that might be interesting to consider is how do we, if the data does already exist because of regulations elsewhere, instead of all of the other regulatory agencies developing their own pediatric regulations, is there a way that we could get that data submitted? And so this is maybe a question to industry, that we could get that data submitted to those other jurisdictions without needing to implement a pediatric requirement in those different countries or jurisdictions. So just a thought to throw out there.
Ralph.
Just very short. Yes, I agree completely. We agree completely with Christina's comment and Peter's comment to come as early as possible. And I mean, this is, I believe, also an achievement of legislation that companies and society has learned and has and is thinking about all of this even much earlier. Just to from a perspective how we are further developing, and in this respect I actually sometimes see legislation also in a sort of competitive way. So not only industry goes back and tells us how important competition is to be efficient and develop, I think it's also a part in the regulatory world that we develop further. So if we all are the same, I'm not so sure whether it would be so ideal. That's always just a thought I have aside. But indeed, we are just about to develop a pilot of a stepwise PIP approach, and that exactly would support the notion of coming early, and where you don't have sufficient evidence yet, and where we all might not know sufficient background of natural history of disease and so on. You might come for a PIP and say, okay, here we have to carry on working, here we have to discuss with multi-stakeholder platforms, etc., and then develop the PIP, as a drug also is being developed. Okay, we are intending this only at the beginning, to be careful for a certain aspects and certain products to be developed, and we just have to try it out how this works. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. So Samadhi, I put you on the spot to offer some reflections from your experience in infectious disease and developing drugs that are often used outside of Europe and the United States at a much greater need. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how we can actually bring real meaning to the word global, instead of pretending that it's just a conversation among the people that are currently on the call.
Right. Thanks. Agreed, Skip. So I think a couple of points. What I really liked in Christina's presentation is how she sort of separated products being developed for pediatrics, which are really for pediatric conditions, whereas you have another whole group of drugs which are really being developed on the backbone of what we know in adults. And I think that's a very good way of thinking. And the latter, which is a vast majority of pediatric products that are being developed on the backbone of adult development, I think really lend themselves to whether we want to call it reliance, collaboration, cooperation, whatever is the word of choice. But I think they really lend themselves to using that approach whereby we can truly make it more global, right? It shouldn't be just between the FDA requirements or the European requirements or a couple of other countries, but I think bringing in regulators from parts of the world where these products actually have value and are likely to be used. Now, in Marie's presentation yesterday, it was very encouraging to see. I think she had gone through some examples, and my understanding is that there are pilot programs that are underway in different parts of the world. And one that Marie had mentioned was the EU M4All. Now, yes, it's primarily meant for diseases or conditions that occur outside of EU, but maybe a model like that could be used. Again, this is in my blue sky view, Christina, add to what your wish list is. There might be a role for certain other products, and I understand, the EU M4All also allows for a parallel process, right? You can get input from, you can approach it in the EU process as well as in the EU M4All approach for products that really play an important role in other parts of the world. So just as an example, again, as I said, I come from an infectious disease background, but if you look at antibacterial drugs and, Peter's point about it takes 6 years or so for drugs to be available and approved for children. I mean, we've looked at it in the anti-infective space. It's anywhere from 7 to 10 years after an antibacterial drug is approved for adults before it's approved in children. And then there's another few years elapsed before it actually is available for use in parts of the world where, in fact, antimicrobial resistance is a bigger problem. So I think in areas like that and for products of that nature, there should be a way for us to engage the regulators in those parts of the world early on in the conversation. And it's really, and I would agree, and this is a point Christina's made as well, it is not at the stage of the marketing authorization or the approval. They need to be part of the discussion, such that when these trials are designed, hopefully we can have global trials with participation and involvement of sites in the trials from the get-go, such that people in whom the product will be used actually are part of the development program. And I think that also will allow for an understanding of what are the country-specific needs. I think Alicia had raised the question of, can we not just submit the information to different regulators? But often actually you're faced with different regulatory requirements, even among these different regions of the world. So some countries will say you need data on patients of that particular ethnicity or from that particular country. So to do that as an afterthought, I think further delays the process. So I do think that there is some room for us approach. It may not be a solution across the board for all products, but I think for certain products, particularly when there is a use for these products in other parts of the world, in a timely manner, I think they should be at the table and part of the discussion in the design of the trial. So, and that one other point I can add to my wish list, I think that's pretty long, is, Marie had mentioned these pilot projects that are underway. I hope that there will be some kind of a report out from these pilot programs, so actually we can understand and learn what has worked and what hasn't worked. At least I've seen a publication with EU M4All. So I think something along those lines about these different pilot projects, if we can understand what are the lessons learned, what worked, what didn't work, so that we can maybe incorporate some of that in our future thinking, I think would be beneficial. But again, it's just my thought.
No, thank you. And I think it's probably the obligation both of sponsors as well as regulatory agencies. If you're seeing these plans where it's clear that the impact as well as the location would be important to have that voice. We're emphasizing patient voice, emphasizing investigator voice, emphasizing multi-stakeholders. I think we need to remember that there are stakeholders that ought to be at the table that may not currently be at the table for many of these programs. We got a few more minutes, and we're sort of at the end of our panel. I wanted to give first of all, thank everyone for your active engagement. I want to particularly thank Christina for a presentation that fostered active engagement with the information that presented, but also wanted to give Christina the privilege of, sort of final comments and not a full summary, that would be impossible, but just her thoughts, having listened to this conversation, and what she might see as potential next steps. So Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Skip. And in many ways, I want everyone just to think back to what Samati just concluded her comments with. I mean, I think if we went back to the early 1990s, prior to the first pediatric policy being proposed through a labeling rule, and where we are today in 2022, the progress that has been made is incredible. In the early 1990s, I was in medical school. No one talked about pediatric medicines development. I was lucky enough to be in a medical school where they were doing surfactant research, Mark. And I was being put out there as a medical student to get consents, which seems now and 30 years later to have been crazy. However, with that said, it is a thrill to be in this space, to look at this screen. The experts on this panel are people that I hold in such esteem, that I so value, who come from different roles, and we're all looking for a way to evolve our space even further. I think it is a great opportunity for us to be able to look at our policies and say, how can we now improve upon them, as opposed to how can we push people to do what we need them to do. And so I challenge all of us to take this opportunity to be thoughtful about some of the comments that you've heard here today, ground them in the wonderful presentations we heard yesterday, and continue that olive branch of finding ways for us to better, efficiently collaborate and cooperate, because our end user ultimately is children. This is a wonderful gift for us to give the children of the globe. And I really do believe that we have people who want to find those solutions to better cooperate. It's not easy. It's been 30 years to get to this point, but we have the passion that I honestly think that so many other spaces lack. And I think that's going to be incredible for us to tap into, to be able to put into reasonable proposals on how we can proceed forward, be it through implementation or legislative, but certainly we should not end the conversation today. This should be considered just the beginning. So Skip, I hope that's what you were looking for. Thank you to all of my wonderful collaborators in the discussion today. It's been a pleasure to do this with you.
No, and thank you, Christina. Perfect. And thanks again, everyone, for your active participation. Let me now turn it back to Lisa, I guess, or Barbara, to bring us to the end of our session.
Thank you. And thank you, Christina. Thank you, panel. Thank you, everyone who's been on today. I really, I kept trying to find the right way of closing this. And in many ways, the deeper the conversation went on and the more it went on, the less closure, but the more opportunity was before us. The question now to me, and we went through a few tangents, in terms of sort of incentive structures for clinicians, for instance, but largely what we heard was a call for greater collaboration, communication, and even greater stakeholder engagement with other communities, the children, their parents, clinicians, earlier, better, not waiting, but moving forward, figuring out what those early sort of pieces one can put together that are not necessarily going to be dependent or wasteful on if a PIP or PSP changes somewhat. In other words, things like dosing, formulation, there are a lot of things that we could think about how to get started and have data as this is coming together. But principally, as I think about this, the question is, how should we carry the conversation forward? And can, for my own limited view, the MRCT Center be helpful in that? Seems to me that there are a few ways to think through moving this forward, and we'll be regrouping as the sort of team that put this together to try and figure out how that can be sustained as an effort. Pilot programs, yes. Inclusion of a greater number of regulatory agencies, yes. Sharing data, interesting to me that some data is not shared more sort of openly with other regulatory agencies, particularly if there were confidentiality in place. I don't see why that would be problematic. So I've got a lot to learn in this space as well. It does occur to me that for the global nature, there are areas or groups that are well served to at least take on some aspects of how this might work, such as ICMRA. WHO obviously is already in this space, but it might be something that is worth a discussion at ICMRA in terms of how we can proceed. I do really appreciate Christina's laying out the formulation of the problem in the way that you did, because it gave us a number of avenues to pursue, enriched then by the discussion, but also, a real way of thinking about the advantages of the current systems that are in place and where their sort of benefits accrue and what opportunities remain available there to pursue and deepen, widen, and expand the effort. I really appreciate, the fact that the regulators from around the globe are here. And what we learned from, I believe, Peter earlier is that if you want to have a party, invite the regulators first, because then everyone does come. And we're thankful to your, being here, but more importantly, your commitment to move this agenda forward in terms of the care and health of our pediatric population and the future of our children. It also, we didn't talk about sort of the incentives for pharma companies as well, which we have talked about in the past to make sure that this commitment to consider and think through pediatric approaches early have a benefit in themselves, and that there is no and also whether we need a PIP for every third and fourth generation, as Peter mentioned, is that necessary? And if not, what do we compromise by not having that? Yes, we need one, we need two, but is that going to motivate people, if they don't have to do pediatrics, to say, okay, let's just drift back a minute and see if another will come forward first? So there are lots of pieces that we need to continue to formulate and think through. And with that, we'll do that in concert with our pediatric representatives and the parent advocacy groups, and make sure that we consider at the get-go of conversations like this, making sure that we have the pediatric voice squarely in the center. We've always begun these with, a video, partly out of respect for the time that these go on with kids, with a video to remind us of why we do this work. We didn't show that again today. We showed that yesterday. But on behalf of the children, their parents, and the many stakeholders that are around this table today, I want to thank you and thank you for your commitment to this work. Thank you, Skip. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, all members of the panel, Christina, and others. The slides will be available probably tomorrow, and the recordings or Friday, one or the other. And we will prepare a summary, and then we will figure out together how this is not the last time we see each other in the Brady Bunch squares that we're used to, but rather how we continue this conversation and make progress. Thank you.
Thank you.